And we're live.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Secular Jihadists for a Muslim Enlightenment. My name is Ali Rizvi, and with me is not Armin Navabi. Armin Navabi couldn't make it this week. Oh, no. Yeah, well, for those of you listening, you're probably wondering where that came from. Yeah. So we have the CEO of Atheist Republic, one of my favorite people, Susanna. Susanna, how are you?
Good. I'm good. I'm really excited for our topic today.
Yeah, so I thought that...
Well, partially because I'm the one who suggested it.
No, I think this is good, and it's actually quite relevant today too, because we're talking today about honor-based violence and more generally honor-based cultures, and the role of religion in helping to perpetuate or maintain some of these cultures, and whether it's a religious thing, whether there's a cultural thing, whether it's one or more. Anyway, we're going to get into all of that, and this topic is actually. It's become more relevant this week. Recently, many of you may have heard of this sort of brutal murder that happened in Pakistan recently. This was a little atypical. You hear about these things happening in the rural areas and villages and sort of tribal courts, but this was the victim was the daughter of a high-level diplomat, the former ambassador in Pakistan. So these were people from the elite class of Pakistan. And her murderer was a guy who was the son of a wealthy industrialist. So this is something that happened. They're generally the high socioeconomic class, high status type people. But just the way that it looked, I mean, the murder was pretty much the same as any other, what you would call honor killing. This is a man who liked this woman. The woman rejected his proposals and his advances, and he couldn't deal with it. So he got her, brought her to his house, kind of essentially imprisoned her there for quite a while, tortured her brutally for hours with he had apparently brass knuckles and everything with himself, stabbings. Just it was terrible what he did to her. And at the end,
she tried to jump off a balcony at one point and was dragged back in somehow.
Right.
Before she was ultimately beheaded.
Right.
It's horrific.
It's horrific. And there were security guards present at the venue. His mother was there as well. And his mother, I think, is a psychotherapist. Right. So
what?
Yeah, I'm telling you. This is a sort of a professional class and of people. This is in a very upscale neighborhood in Islamabad, the F7 sector. So this is totally shocked everybody, because this man is very similar to a lot of friends that I have, a lot of people I've known people like this. I think even know somebody who knows him or knew him or was an acquaintance with this guy. So there's like
similarity in terms of
just
actions or temperament, or just class.
Well, class, actions, temperament. I mean, the way that he talked, everything is like basically, and that's not to say that every Pakistani male is like this, but it's just interesting. What struck me about this was that that mentality, right, is still, it doesn't discriminate, as you said earlier, Susanna, before we got into this. It doesn't discriminate. It's in the. So the question is, is it a cultural thing? Is it a religious thing? Is it both? Why does it still exist? Why do you find this more in some cultures and not in others? So I wanted to get your reaction to this, because I know you don't know about this, but there was in the early 2000s in Buffalo, where I was living, in Buffalo, New York, at the time, I was doing my residency there, and there was a new TV channel that they launched, like a national sort of cable channel in the US called Bridges TV. And this was after 9/11, right? And it was launched by, let me see. Yeah, and then eventually they moved to New York City in July 2011. July 2011, that's much later. But the guy's name was, the founder, the CEO, his name was Muzammil Hassan, right? And he thought that after 9/11, Muslims were being stereotyped. So they said, moderate Muslims should not be able to identify. They shouldn't be identified with these extreme stereotypes. This is a quote that he said. He said that moderate Muslims cannot identify with the extreme stereotypes often depicted in Hollywood productions, and said that they think they're not accurately portrayed, and Bridges TV is here to give American Muslims a voice that will depict them in everyday real life situations. And he wanted to use this, launch this channel to balance negative portrayals of Muslims following 9/11. So my younger brother was a musician. This is the first time I heard of it. He came to Buffalo to visit me, and he was invited to perform. So, they had music. This was a Muslim, a thing for Muslims, not necessarily Islamic, but for American Muslims. So he performed songs on it. He was there. Okay, so a little while later, I don't know, I should be laughing. This isn't funny. I think it's 2009. Muzammil Hassan, the CEO, gets arrested. Right? So this channel that he started to kind of counter the negative stereotypes of Muslims being violent and terrorists and all that stuff. He was arrested and charged with beheading his wife.
Oh my God!
He was separated from his wife. Her name was Asiya Zubair. She also worked with him at Bridges TV. Like together they founded it, and at the station, it was right there at the Bridges TV station, that venue where they worked. They found her body, her decapitated body.
Okay.
Right? So, yeah. So this is it's just extremely ironic.
Out of curiosity, was he born and raised in the States, or was he an immigrant to America?
Oh, that I don't know. It's
not entirely relevant, but
yeah. Well, I mean, it is an interesting. It's always an interesting question. But he was. So this was a huge issue. I mean, this guy totally lost it. Same thing, the woman he was with, his wife was leaving him, and he couldn't deal with it. So he went and he beheaded her and killed her right at the TV station, at the office that they had founded to counter these stereotypes of American Muslims or of Muslims overall. Right. And so it's just bizarre, the whole situation. So it's extreme. It became a big deal then. And, this highlights the issue of, honor killings are they're directly related to domestic violence. And they made the case that Islam does not support, does not condone this kind of honor killing, which is true. It doesn't. But when it comes to domestic violence, that's the question. They're also saying that Islam does not condone domestic violence, but that, as we're going to get into it later, is not true. That's not true.
We're skeptical.
Yeah, we are skeptical. So yeah, I think So I have the answer to your question. Muzammil Hassan, he came to the U.S. from Pakistan at age 17. Right? So yeah, the reason I think that it's important to highlight both of these cases is because this is one is a sort of elite, educated, the higher socioeconomic class Pakistani family in Islamabad, right? That's the murder that happened, and the other is an American Muslim family, right? With entrepreneurs who are living in Buffalo, New York. So this is and the story is always the same. It's the same as all the other honor killings that you see everywhere else. And if you have this kind of thing happening in these higher sort of strata of society, then what hope do people have, who are not as privileged, like the less privileged people, where, there are thousands and thousands of honor killings that happen every year that completely go unnoticed. So, and this isn't just a Pakistan thing. It's not just an Islam thing. This is also in neighboring India. India has a huge sort of crisis when it comes to violence against women, rape, sexual assault. There have been many, many headlines out of India that happen. And yeah, go ahead.
Well, just for our audience, I think I should give the not exactly a warning, but just kind of like preface that I think a lot of this conversation is probably going to focus around Pakistan or just the Desi region, because that is where Ali has a lot of background and knowledge, and also the killing of Noor is particularly kind of the launching pad for this discussion, right? So we're kind of looking at it through that as a touchstone. But this is an issue that is global. It's again, it's not exclusive to Islam. It's a huge problem in India, and honor-based violence isn't exclusive to women. Um, I think his name was Ali Reza in Iran, a young homosexual man who was
Right.
honor killed by his family when they discovered that he was gay. Or I think of even men who are the victims of intercaste violence who are killed because of dating women outside of their caste. Now, that might have a little bit more of a retribution angle to it than honor from one's own family, although sometimes it is. But it all falls within the same territory of collectivist violence, basically. And I think it's very tricky thing to try to untangle, especially delicately when talking about people's different cultural backgrounds, because I was trying to look up some statistics on this to get a better perspective. And I found a site called Honor-Based Violence Awareness Network, and they had some statistics and data. However, on their website, I don't know how up to date this is, so I'm taking this with a grain of salt. But they say, again, I don't know how the recency of this, but they say that there are roughly 5,000 honor killings internationally per year. That's definitely underreported. It's just a fact that that's underreported.
Right.
1,000 of those are said to have occurred in India. Another 1,000 are said to have occurred in Pakistan. And then the only other statistic that they give is that 12 occur in the UK. So again, I don't know how accurate or recent that these numbers are, but like almost half of honor-based violence that is reported and recorded is in a very specific region of the world. So we have to acknowledge that. And based on the people, in my capacity at Atheist Republic who talk to me, who ask me for help, you notice patterns, right? So it's almost exclusively from the Middle East, North African region, and the Desi region.
South Asia, yeah. South Asia, the Desi region. So there's a couple of things. One thing I'll say is, when you talked about the retribution aspect, where they actually killed the guy who was dating the girl, they're both connected. Usually if there is a woman who brought shame to the family and insulted the honor of the family by having an affair with somebody she wasn't supposed to, of a lower caste or different religion, different sect, different class, then, or just having an affair in general, because I mean that's that itself is taboo.
Any relationship outside of marriage.
Any relationship outside of marriage. So if they do that, they're usually
kind of an arranged marriage specifically.
Yeah, if there's whoever the man is that's involved, or the partner, the retribution goes hand in hand, because they usually happen simultaneously. They happen together. So yeah, and the other thing is, there's you're talking about these statistics, and I agree with you. They're very, very underreported. Most of these cases just kind of go under the radar. They're just taken care of by tribal elders in rural areas and so on. And they have their own sort of tribal courts, often that have no oversight whatsoever. And they'll actually prescribe punishments at times. Like if there's a man and he has an affair with one family, the daughter of one family, and they're not happy with that, then the courts, these tribal courts, will actually say that this guy's sister should be allowed to be gang raped, for instance, by the family. They'll actually prescribe things like that. And the
Taliban is notorious for that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I should say that actually has no basis in the Islamic religion. Like, we have to be clear about that. And we don't want to say, like, is it related to certain elements of religious patriarchy? Yeah, I mean that's a whole different topic. But that's not something that's sanctioned in Islam, or I think in any religion, like the prescription of gang rape, for instance. But these things, they do happen. That's part of the culture. And many times it doesn't even have to be an honor killing. They don't necessarily do the honor killing. They'll have, like, for example, a prescribed, that kind of thing. You've heard of the when a lot of these men, they don't necessarily kill the woman, but they'll get somebody to throw acid in her face, and that'll disfigure her for life. And we've heard those kinds of stories as well. It happens a lot in Afghanistan, happens in Pakistan. I think recently there was even a case in New York City. And obviously the guy who did it was from the Desi region, right? So, this pattern, like, there is a pattern that happens exclusively in these areas.
Before we really dig into this much further, I think we should, set a foundation of just like giving a definition. So I'm just going to read the definition of honor killing off of Wikipedia so that our audience like understands kind of where we're drawing our boundaries, around this conversation. So honor killing is the murder of an individual. So again, not sex specific, either an outsider or a member of the family, by someone seeking to protect what they see as the dignity and honor of their family. Religion is often a motive, and those killed will often be more liberal than the murderer, rather than being generally quote unquote dishonorable. So that's a very broad definition. Obviously, there is a lot of violence against women throughout the world. For example, there's a report from the UN in 2018 that says that there are 50,000 women a year that are killed by their intimate partners or family members. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the broader circle. And then honor-based violence is more of a violence that comes from a specific motive within, that larger perspective of intimate partner violence. It's honestly such a hard topic to talk about for obvious reasons. And I wanted to, kind of for my own understanding, get your perspective as someone who is from Desi culture, grew up in Pakistan, spent 12, 13 years of your life in Saudi Arabia, on living in a culture that involves a value towards this very kind of diffuse concept of honor. Because I'm from America, I've spent my entire life on the West Coast of the United States. It, by most scales of, collectivist versus independent societal orientations, America, I think, is the most hyper individualistic culture in the world. So for me, it's honestly hard to understand this impetus towards honor, because I think growing up in a religious family like I did, there is inherently a sense of some collective identity. When you grow up in a religious community, your family wants the community that you're in to see that you are being good at following religious tenets.
Right.
But it's nowhere near the level of what we see in other parts of the world. And I have a hard time even understanding how to approach the topic sometimes, because it's so outside of my purview of understanding a relationship amongst people and from the individual to society, like the micro, macro, etc. So I'd really like to hear what it's like being amongst that.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question, because I completely understand. There's and I don't want to. I don't want to be culturally relativistic here, but in the places I grew up, people did not understand that hyper individualism. They didn't understand why there's so much depression in the U.S. These people, they're rich. They have all this money. They've got all these celebrities that are doing drugs and killing themselves. Why is this happening? What do they have? All the school shootings, disturbed sort of mental health issues. And that's something that they have trouble understanding. But there's a sort of an anthropological, sociological spectrum, concept of the spectrum of cultures, where they talk about guilt cultures, shame cultures, and fear cultures, right? So so if you have a guilt society, and that's called, the United States, a hyper individualistic culture would be, for example, a guilt culture. Right, and these guilt cultures, guilt is a more individual thing. You do something wrong, you feel bad about it. Okay, and it doesn't matter if anybody else knows about it, whether you've been caught or not. It's like, you see in those movies, do something terrible, and the guilt eats you up for the rest of your life. So the US is an example of a guilt society. And so people from guilt cultures will say something like, is what I did, is this fair? Is it unfair? Is it just? Was it the right thing to do for me? I mean, they'll ask themselves those questions. Now, in a shame culture, shame is more sort of publicly oriented, right? So shame is about, you don't want to be shamed in front of people. Like Cersei in Game of Thrones, walking down saying shame, shame, shame to her. So the question here is, it's about getting caught, getting exposed, doing something really bad, and then being shamed for it, right? So if in a shame culture, people when they engage in these behaviors, they may say, how will it look if I do this? How will people perceive it? What are people going to think? This is something you hear people joke about and complain about in Desi culture. It's like, the aunties like, what are people going to think? What are the neighbors going to think? So that is a very, very integral element of shame-based culture. So places like honor cultures and shame cultures are essentially synonymous. I mean, that's how it works.
I think a very key distinction, and while you were talking about cultures, this is more, what I'm about to say is more specific to a definition that's more appropriate towards the individual, but I think it's good for people to think about. So the difference between shame and guilt is that guilt is oriented towards an action, meaning like think about a kid eating a cookie when they shouldn't have. Their parents told them not to. The guilt reaction would be the kid would say like, I did a bad thing. So guilt is attributed to an action versus shame is attributed to the character of that individual. Right. So it's like, I ate a cookie when I wasn't supposed to. I am bad.
Yeah.
Versus I did a bad thing. So it's a very important and vast distinction between the level of like responsibility that you put towards an individual. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so and there are those aspects to it. I think there are entire descriptions of the features of a guilt society, a shame society. And the third society that I was talking about, the third is a fear culture. And in that, it's basically, if I do this, what is the government going to do to me? What's a mob going to do to me? What's going to be my punishment if I do that? So that's a fear culture. So those are just very generally, and I think all societies have elements of all three, obviously, but there are some that are more centered around one or the other concept or type of culture. So it has a lot to do with like the shame culture. The societal aspect is a huge part of those kinds of societies. The places where I grew up, and it is really hard to understand where the other's coming from. Whether you're here looking over there, whether you're there looking here. It feels really, really alien sometimes.
Well, and then I want to move into how responsible Islam is for this type of behavior in a second. But just kind of put a bow on the experience of honor culture, like, you probably had that mindset at what time in your life?
The honor thing?
Yeah. I mean, what do you think?
I might have sort of subconsciously. I don't know. I think I'd probably. I never consciously had that. I mean, in the case of my parents, in my family, the women were generally very well educated. Like my mother has a doctorate, she's a PhD.
Yeah.
My sister is a physician. She's a specialist in rheumatology. I grew up in a sort of I grew up in the same kind of, I guess, privileged class that these Noor and Zahir Jafar grew up in. But yeah, I never had those kinds of. I was always told that those things are wrong. In terms of the violence, but in terms of shame, I think you're right. I think when it comes to what people are going to think and how you look to others and how you're supposed to behave, especially with the women in the family or the girls in the family, and how that has to be different from the guys. I think that there were elements of that even with me growing up.
Yeah, I shouldn't put so much of it onto you, right? Because I'm not trying to make this a judgment. I'm just trying to get perspective. Um, what I mean is like you, not even you, you were surrounded by it, and that attitude, you probably saw it in your classmates more. But it's probably not too much of an assumption to say that women are much more of a subject of this culture than men.
Yes, they are, and I will. I mean, the reason that you're asking, I'm not insulted or anything like that. I actually I'm thinking about this right now aloud, as you guys can all hear.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is that yeah? I think I did when I was younger. I grew up thinking that yeah, they had different roles and responsibilities. So I mean, grew up in the like late '70s, '80s. Around that time, that's what yeah, that is the way that I was kind of raised. And I was raised to think, even though I came from a relatively privileged
Mm-hmm.
family, that they had different roles. At that time, though, I think it was just it wasn't just because I was Desi. That was kind of the view in a lot of places. Even here, people
Of
had
course,
these
people
sorts
care
of
about what people think. I mean, we're social
yeah.
animals, but it's like, to what extent is this like a very active consideration? Or,
Yeah, that's the
I
thing.
mean,
You were very conscious
yeah,
of it, and it was it was a very active consideration immediately around the society where I grew up. So in Saudi Arabia, obviously, all the women had to go out wearing these black cloaks called abayas, right? And there was a time when my mother was, and this is at a supermarket. I think I've told the story before, and her head cover slipped a little bit. You can see her hair, and this religious police guy came and with a stick. He wanted to hit her on the head with it.
oh
So
Jesus.
yeah, and so these kinds of things, we saw growing up on a daily basis. I mean, the fact that she couldn't drive,
Mm-hmm.
she had
Yeah,
to.
that's extremely informative and to you as a young child.
Yeah, you grow up and you normalize these things, so that definitely has an effect on how you're going to treat people when you grow up, or the kind of, I guess you do absorb some of it, you do internalize some of it. And I noticed this when I had like the first time I dated somebody, the first relationship I was in. There's a lot of things I was challenged on by my first girlfriend, who was, by the way, really, like, I think it was one of the biggest influences in my life in terms of getting me to think differently. And yeah, I had certain preconceptions that I had to really reassess and reevaluate and evolve out of.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, those elements definitely were there.
So I think now we should turn to how much we can blame Islam for this,
Yeah.
because in my observation, I mean, I've never like debated a Dawa guy or Islamic speaker or debater before, so it's not personal experience, but just watching other people do it. Um, a lot of people make the mistake of saying that this is Islamic, that this is directly attributed to Islam, and then when you're asked to show the receipts, you can't
Mhm.
in specific cases. And so the question comes down to like, what in scripture specifically and directly allows this, and this can be the Quran, this can be hadith, or just a scholarly understanding, right? And then to what extent is it quote unquote Islamic culture? Because I mean, there's for example, Christmas isn't in the Bible, right?
Yeah.
But it's Christian culture. So dr- making that distinction is very important for anyone who likes to think about Islam, especially criticism of it, to really understand and be able to draw those boundaries very sharply. So you have more of a background into the actual scripture
Mhm.
than I do. So I think we should dive into what is actually present there.
Yeah. So let me sort of set up the stage for that conversation by talking about this, just in terms of this killing that happened with Noor Mukadam. Um, at the same month that this month, essentially, the Pakistani parliament had a bill in front of them. They had legislation that was proposing that women should be protected from violence in the home. It's pretty straightforward. Domestic violence, it's anti-domestic violence legislation in Pakistan. The Pakistani parliament is being faced with this. That should we pass legislation saying that women should not be subject to violence in the home, including by their husbands, right? Especially by their husbands. And the parliament voted no on this. So they rejected it. And they decided to essentially outsource it to what they have. They have this Islamic Ideology Council, right? And this Islamic Ideology Council, based on the Quran and Islamic scripture, had previously said that it was permissible for a husband to beat his wife, based on Surah 4, verse 34, and we're going to get into the details on that as well. So the parliament essentially outsourced it to them, and they decided to rule on this. So this is the status of how the word elite literally means like elected. So this is the elected class. This is the Pakistani parliament. This is the way they're thinking. We know recently about Imran Khan, the Prime Minister Imran Khan's comments about how if women are going to dress a certain way. He did this interview with Axios with Jonathan Swan, who's brilliant. Oh no, I think that was it. Yeah, I think it was that. I can't remember whether it was that interview with
where he talks about purda.
Yeah, and he said, if women, if they provoke men, this kind of thing is going to happen. So he's kind of doing
it's the age-old classic slut shaming, just different language, different name. You are responsible for the violence that men inflict on you based on what you're wearing, and if you're wearing whatever is this diffuse idea of what is and is not okay, then you deserve it, basically, and that you're asking for it, and that it's to be expected, which actually belies an incredibly low opinion of men. Right.
That's a problem. It's actually quite insulting to men in general. This is an issue. This is the way that the Pakistani government, the Pakistani prime minister, who, by the way, is supposed to be who's supposed to be progressive, right? He's a Western educated guy, international sports
married star. For the third time.
Married for the third time. His first wife was Jemima Goldsmith, who's a British woman. And he also had, I think, affairs with Goldie Hawn and he was really, really out there for the first half of his life. And then, we came back to Pakistan, suddenly became religious very conveniently later in his life. At that point, he had women in his life that he actually wanted to control. That's speculation, but I think I'm pretty spot on with that. So this is the attitude towards domestic violence. So now, if you look at domestic violence stats in Pakistan, there was a 200% increase in domestic violence between January and March 2020. Okay, so this is from Human Rights Watch.
3 months?
Yeah, there was that's what it says. It says between January and March. I don't know I think they looked at all domestic violence incidents between January and March, and they saw there was a 200% increase in domestic violence from before that period.
And then that was before everyone went into lockdown. And across the world, we've seen just an explosion when people have had to go into lockdown because there's just way tighter control. You can't get away from people who abuse you. Really.
You can't. And domestic violence, child abuse, these things, they exploded during the lockdown, right? Because people frustrated at home and they're stuck. They can't really do anything, as you're saying. And in Pakistan, those stats actually increased even further. So 200% increase between January and March was actually, these were the domestic violence stats prior to the pandemic, right? So this has been an issue, and then now you have this domestic violence legislation that's being shut down and being outsourced to Islamic ideology councils. So this is one of the problems with the religious aspect, Susanna, right? Is that in a secular society, you can have activist groups coming and saying this is wrong. You shouldn't hit women. Women have rights. They have all of your stuff, common sense stuff that we all know now. You can say these things.
I wish we all knew that.
And then you have courts, and you can make these arguments, and you don't really run up into any kind of barriers. Now in Pakistan or in Saudi Arabia, if you try to make this argument, the husband beats his wife. She comes in, she's like, he beat me, and he's like, well, yeah, she was disobeying me, right? And then her lawyers say, well, it's wrong to beat women. You know, women have just the same rights that men do. And then someone comes in, they're like, well, we're an Islamic country. Here's Surah 4, verse 34 from the Quran. It says that you're allowed to beat your wife. And now you've hit a barrier. Okay.
Yeah, because they'll say, by what authority? My authority comes from the one above. Your authority is these international conventions that have the basis in these infidel countries.
So then
it's totally uneven.
It is. It's very uneven. And then what do you do? What do you do at that point? Do you go and start challenging the scripture, right? And this is the same thing with, for instance, older men who marry girls, like, you know, someone in there, the guy in his late 40s getting married to an 8-year-old. And this was a case that happened in Saudi Arabia. And the judge would not grant her a divorce. The Saudi Arabia's higher judicial council. This is a case that happened many years ago. And the argument was that, well, you know, the Prophet Muhammad, you know, when he was 53, he had a 9-year-old wife, Aisha. So based on that, this is sunnah, this is permissible. Right? There's a verse in the Quran, Surah 65, verse 4, that actually has instructions on how to divorce a wife who hasn't menstruated yet, right? So someone who is prepubescent, if you're married to, how to divorce. I mean, these things are sanctioned by the Quran and the Hadith. So what do you do? And the Quran and the Sunnah. So what do you do? I mean, do you challenge them? If you challenge them, then there's another problem you're facing. You're a lawyer. You're challenging this whole thing with domestic violence. They accuse you of blasphemy. You're going against God's word.
Your lawyer might get assassinated. That's what happens.
Yeah. And what do we know about blasphemy laws in Pakistan?
You will. It's very likely you may die before you even get to the police office.
Right. So there's a. So this is a challenge. This is a problem. I mean, people will say a lot of these aspects of this honor culture, they're cultural, they're not religious. And the thing is, they're rooted in a system, in a religious-based system that essentially puts them in a time warp. These actions puts them in a time warp and freezes them. It cements them in that time so that you can't evolve beyond it. You have these sort of blasphemic barriers that you can't go up against and you can't move beyond, right? And that's where the religious aspect comes in. And this, you know, you can see in if you go back, you know, a couple of centuries in Europe, in Christian Europe, at the time, it's very similar things, right? The violence against women and everything.
I'm very glad you brought that up because I get very I mean, I understand where people are coming from. There's a lot of people who talk about Christianity being this softer religion, when what they're really trying to get at is behavior of Christians is softer than what they see in other groups. Whereas if you look into the text of the Bible, or even, you know, maybe like the Catechism of the Catholic Church, or original renditions of it, you see a lot of the same attitudes towards women. So we should be attributing that difference in behavior to the change in values of Christians, that as opposed to their actual scripture and ideology being better.
Because I mean, it's not actually. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I mean, you see the same thing in like ultra Orthodox Jewish communities. The ways that women are treated is horrific. It might not be death, right? But it still belies a possession towards the female sex. So the broader point that I wanted to get to was that when, in terms of attributing things to Islam, like, let's just take Islam. In terms of attributing things to Islam specifically, you have to be very exact. So, like, you can say that it is Islamic it's actually mandated or suggested by God to beat your wife. But even then, you have to be clear that if you're going to be accurate, it is under specific conditions, right? Mm. And you can easily correctly say that if a father murders one of his children, he gets a lessened sentence for the murder of his daughters, right? Mm-hmm. So that belies a specific attitude. When I'm making arguments about the extent to which Islam is directly responsible for the continuation and perpetuation of this type of culture, I instead try to focus on the ways in which the scripture validates an attitude of a complete possession of women. Because when I think about honor-based culture and just the ways that people talk about this, I mean, this includes Hindu societies as well. It can, in my mind, it can really be encapsulated just by talking about, like, you think that you can possess women, that this is your property, and that you have to defend it in some way. So this is why there's so much violence in India regarding love jihad or interfaith marriages, because, well, specifically these far-right Hindu groups think of these women as their possessions, and that these Muslim men are taking them away from them, they're robbing them, and then therefore taking the children that will likely result from that marriage away from their community, and weakening their community by this like very sinister kind of conspiracy of like demographic engineering. Like,
yeah, it's like this religious poaching operation, where they're taking people. Yeah.
There was this incident that happened very recently, and I saw Dee in the live chat talking about this, where there was a 17-year-old girl earlier in July who, 17, she was murdered by her family for wearing jeans during a Hindu ritual. And they had admonished her many times about wearing these jeans. And she would just say, jeans are meant to be worn. And they rendered her unconscious from beating her with lathis. And then when they were supposed to take her to a hospital, instead the next day her body was found hanging from a bridge for wearing jeans, you know, and for wearing Western clothes. So to me, that just gets at this attitude of like, you are progressing away from our collective identity. We have to reel you back in at all cost, because what you do by association reflects back on us, and we have to prove to the people around us that we are committed to this in-group, very firm identity, even if that goes to the extent of taking out our own family members. And so just again, going back to how much we can attribute this to religion directly, I fall back on the aspects that emphasize a possession over women. And Quran 434 like literally begins with talking about men having possession over women, something along the lines of like, Allah gives men to those that which they are supposed to protect.
Yeah, so I'll read that out, and I'll talk about like the how people try to defend it, and I'm going to counter that as well. I think we'll do that in a few minutes. But I wanted to say, like, one of the reasons that we titled this "To What Extent Is Religion Responsible?" and not just Islam, is because all religions, all of them, are misogynistic. Okay, they look at women as second-class citizens. This includes Buddhism, right? If you go with canonical Buddhism, they're obviously very different. There are many different versions of Buddhism, but anyway, even if you look at that, you look at Hinduism, you look at Hindu society, whether it's now, right, or you look at texts like the Manu Samriti. You have the Quran, obviously, it's full of all kinds of double standards against women. Women are clearly thought of as a possession, as secondary to men. You look at the Bible, you talked about the Hasidic Jews, like they basically take the Old Testament very, very literally. They take it extremely seriously. The New Testament too, in Christianity, women are supposed to be quiet. They're supposed to think of their husbands as their masters. They're supposed to stay silent. They're supposed to be subdued. They're supposed to cover their hair. I mean, that's all in the New Testament as well. And the point that I was trying to make when I was talking about Christian Europe, it isn't that not making comparison between Christians and Muslims today, but at the time, right, that honor culture Christian Europe was essentially an honor culture as well. And it wasn't the way that the Christians changed is because there was a Protestantization. There was an Enlightenment process, and then there was the secularization process. Right, these things happened, and so I think you're frozen. Are you there? Can you hear me? Okay. Let me know if you guys can still hear. Anyway, so there was and they moved from that phase and they secularized, they separated religion from state, as is what happened in the United States and then happened in basically the rest of these. A lot of the Western societies that we have now are largely secular, and that's what ultimately countered it, right? But the biggest, one of the biggest things that is, yeah, okay, thank you, music guy. I'm still on, so we'll just wait for her to come back. One of the biggest sort of central things in all of them, this is why I say all religion, and this is a huge thing in Christianity and in Islam, is the story of the Virgin Mary. The story of the Virgin Mary. This is the sort of the prototype for honor culture, or for just honor-based thinking everywhere. So if you think of Mary, Mary is a virgin. That's a virtue. Okay, so she's never been touched by any man, and so she's innocent. She's chaste. Her own conception was an immaculate conception. She is pure. She's just not touched in any way. It's completely innocent. And then she gives birth to the Son of God, right? And what's important about this is essentially her birth canal, as Christopher Hitchens said, is her birth canal is basically a one-way street. Right? God forbid any man comes near her, right? Because apparently that would sully her in some way. It would pollute her or taint her. So this purity and the purity of virginity and the virtue of virginity, and of a woman being untouched, is sort of exemplified in the story of the Virgin Mary, because apparently all of her honor, right, all of her virtue is somehow between her legs, right? And this is hey Susanna, you're back.
Sorry about that. My computer crashed.
Yeah, so I was talking just about the Virgin Mary and how that concept is central to Christianity, obviously, but it's also a very big concept in Islam too. The fact that she was a virgin, and that's why she was considered innocent and chaste. And then now when we talk about virginity, we talk about losing virginity, right? Even though it's not something you lose, you basically gain a new part of your life that's not so bad. That's actually quite a good part of your life. So you're not exactly. Yeah. You're not exactly losing anything when we talk about deflowering, right? That's the same thing. You're violating their innocence. So this concept of honor, right? Honor being sort of between a woman's legs is something that is pervasive, and it's been there in all of these religions. With this Hinduism, Christianity, at the fundamental level of Christianity, like with the story of Virgin Mary, Islam, obviously. And even some of these other sort of hippie religions, all of them tend to have women as possessions and as second-class citizens. So to move away from this, right? These previous religious societies have had to secularize. If you didn't have the Enlightenment, you wouldn't have been able to move. Christians wouldn't have been able to move from that to the sort of like hippie, dilute version of Christianity that they're living in today. Thank God. Well, relative to before.
Thank God.
I mean, it's relative on a relative scale. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on where you are. Dee in the live chat was talking about the just prolific levels of violence against women in Central America, which is a very religious region, particularly Roman Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
Although I think kind of the flavor of it being honor-based it's a bit different. I don't quite get that same tone or inflection.
The possession aspect is still there. Like,
yes.
They have to, in terms of choosing what to do with their bodies and, having prescribing what they can or cannot do with their bodies. I mean, that's something that's part of it. So the patriarchal possession aspect is still.
Yeah, you have guys, if you haven't read Ali's book, you need to. Okay, read The Atheist Muslim. You have a great quote, which maybe you can actually give me verbatim, but basically, like, you can't be against patriarchy and support religion. It's just incompatible.
Yeah, like if you want to fight patriarchy, but you're not fighting religion, then you're not fighting patriarchy. You're just not.
Thank you. Yeah,
that's basically it.
guys, I mean, I'm not just saying this because he's right here, but you should go read his book, because it really does a really good job of unpacking a lot of specific verses and apologetics that people use to try to explain away and soften and, you know, make the Quran like niceties, you know, in a very easy to understand way. And I really, after reading your book, I felt really well equipped to handle those rebuttals, especially how people try to like reinterpret the Arabic of, you know, I don't know, something bahuna or something, you know, like the actual verb for beat them. And
oh yeah, wadribuhunna, and we're gonna get. I'll actually get into that right now. Should I?
Yeah, go for it.
So yeah, this is basically what Susanna was talking about. What we were talking about earlier is in the Quran. There is this one verse that is used to justify domestic violence, essentially across the board, whether it's in Pakistan or whether it's in Saudi Arabia, and that's Surah 4, which is you know, the Surah Nisa. Nisa means women. And verse 34. And this is the translation of it. This is how it's translated by. This is a Sahih international translation. Quote: Men are in charge of women by right of what Allah has given one over the other, and what they spend for maintenance from their wealth. So righteous women are devoutly obedient, guarding in the husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them, then if they persist, forsake them in bed, and finally strike them. But if they obey you once more, seek no means against them. Indeed, Allah is ever exalted and grand. Right? So this is, by the way, just to say that this isn't if they're arrogant or if they're disobedient. I mean, people say it's disobedience, arrogance, depending on the translation. It's not if they are disobedient. It's if you just fear disobedience, then you're allowed to take these measures. You're supposed to advise and admonish them first. If they persist, then you essentially have them sleep in a separate room. It's like, you know, we're not going to sleep together. And then finally, if they continue, if the fear of disobedience continues, then you're allowed to hit them. Right now, the term, right, is wadribuhunna or adribuhunna in Arabic. That's a term that means beat them or strike them. And the Marmaduke Pickthall translation translates it as scourge them. So who translated it as beat them and strike them? Yusuf Ali, M.H. Shakir, Mohsen Khan, Muhammad Sarwar, and J. Dawood, like all of them, a lot of these really prominent translations, and especially the earlier translations, have translated this as beat your wives, beat them. But now you have had recently all these sort of new age translators, and this is all just basically in the last century or so. This has never happened before that. And these people are saying, like, for example, there's this guy named Ahmad Shafat. He's a Pakistani Canadian guy. The Tahir al-Qadri, who's also another Pakistani Canadian. Apparently, they're all Pakistani Canadian people who are reinterpreting the scripture to mean something different.
How do you feel about that as a Pakistani? No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, I know. How do I feel
Canadian? You're like, what the?
Yeah. So remember, these are not people who know. They're not native Arabic speakers, not as familiar with Arabic. They've learned it. They've studied it. And it's all secondhand. And so Ahmad Shafat translates it as beat or separate them from you, right? Which is a little strange because that's the second step. You're supposed to separate them from you anyway. So why would you do that again? And then Tahir al-Qadri, he translates as turn away from them, striking a temporary parting. So he's like, you're not striking them. You're not striking the women. You're just striking a temporary parting. So you're, I guess, initiating a temporary parting. I don't know. So apparently,
I don't even know what that means.
Apart from Arabic, he's not very good at English either. So this is the question, and a lot of these sort of new age apologist scholars like Reza Aslan, they believe that they think like, why was it translated as beat them? Because these are male dominated, misogynistic interpreters who interpreted the Quran in that way. And he kind of blamed it. He didn't blame it on the Quran. He said the Quran is perfectly fine. It's the people who interpreted it. Those were the misogynists, right? So that's his approach, which clearly it doesn't make sense. So let's get into this, right? So there's the word for adribuhunna, for beat them, is that word adribu is derived from daraba, right? Daraba is a word that that means, well, it doesn't just mean beat. So in Surah 4, verse 101, it's used in the form darabtum, which means to go forth. In Surah 3, verse 156, it's darabu, which means to travel through. In that context of that verse, in verse 2, Surah 2, verse 61, it's waduribat, which is also derived from daraba. That means to be humiliated. So there are different contexts in which daraba, the word beat, quote unquote, literally translated as beat, it means. So that's why a lot of these New Age sort of apologist scholars are saying that it doesn't mean, wadribuhunna, that doesn't mean beat your wife. It could mean to move away from them, to separate from them, to humiliate them, or to go forth, or to go forth, or as Raza Aslan says, to go forth and have intercourse with them. So that's a third tier of punishment. The third thing is that you should just go and have sex with them, apparently, which doesn't make any sense in the context of the verse.
Contradicts the verse.
Yeah, so it's
Okay.
they're sort of doing all of these crazy mental gymnastics, trying to move away from the actual words, right? So, people think a lot of this, they say, okay, well, it's true that the word daraba, the word beat, is used in different contexts and means different things depending on, it's a verb, right? So what depending on the object that it's being applied to, right? But now let's look at English, the English language. Okay, so you have the word hit or strike. Let's look at both of them. Okay, so you can say hit. You know what hit means? It means to hit somebody, right?
Yes,
if I say
I do.
Hit a woman, that means that you strike a woman. That's what it means. But you can say, let's hit the road. Does that mean to beat the road? No. Hit the lights. Let's hit the goal. When you hit the bottle, which is one of my favorite things to do. Okay, no, it's not. I don't drink that much. So hitting the bottle, that doesn't mean you're actually grabbing a bottle and hitting it. It means that you're okay. So these are the different ways in which the word hit is used, or hit me up, then, or hit on. When you say hit on a woman, that's a completely different thing from hit the woman. It's two totally opposite things.
It's kind of the opposite.
Yeah. So you see what I'm getting at. This is just a verb, and it's used in all kinds of senses, and it could be colloquial senses, and some of these are more formal, right? So strike, the word strike, what do you do when you have a deal? You strike a deal. You can strike a balance between two things. You can, again, go up, strike up a conversation with a woman. You can say that completely makes sense, but it doesn't have anything to do with hitting, right? And you can go on a strike. But here's the thing. If I say I want to strike a balance in one part of a scripture, and I say I want to, hit the bottle in another part of the scripture, hit the lights in another part of the scripture, and then I say hit the woman or strike a woman, right? Just because I use the same word, like hit the woman, does still mean to beat a woman. It doesn't mean to strike up a conversation with a woman. It doesn't mean to hit. So, this is clearly obvious. I think everybody knows where I'm going with this.
The moral of the story is that if you ask basically any native Arabic speaker, like what this means, they're like, yeah, it means punch. It means violence,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that's the thing. Like, if you have, for example, when it says in Surah 4, verse 101, when it says hit the earth, right? It's a darabtum fil ardi, it means hit the earth, right? And it's so, and where it's used as humiliation, the full phrase is wadurabat alayhimuz zillatu, right? Which is, I can't pronounce it very well, but that means that they were hit with humiliation. So yes, the verb that's used is daraba. It does mean hit. It does mean strike. But the context in which it's used, the direct object of what the verb is being applied to, is completely different in each case. And in Surah 4, verse 34, it is women. That's the object. So you're supposed to hit women. Apparently, if you wanted to say you should abandon them or not hit them, then I think the term would have been adrubu anhunna. It wouldn't be adrubu anhunna. That totally changes everything. So that's basically the countering to a lot of these sort of hippie interpretations of the verse, and this is just one of them that we got into.
Well,
there are many other sort of misogynistic verses in the Quran.
it's Music Guy brings up an interesting point, where he's saying ridiculous how they try to change it, meaning a lot of kind of reformist minded scholars or translators saying it's a sin,
Yeah.
meaning the Quran actually directly advises against innovation, bid'ah, trying to reinterpret. It's supposed. I'm making generalizations. There are, a lot of strong schools of thought that it's like this is what it is, and we don't have the authority to interpret. And
Right.
people trying to make that effort, especially in the act of translation, are doing exactly that.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So,
Mhm.
I think we're at time. So let's take a few questions,
Yes.
Patron, unless you have
Perfect.
something else to say, Susanna.
No, I was just going to make that segue too.
Wonderful.
Guys, if you are listening to this after the fact or the audio, if you are a patron, link is in the description if you would like to or able to support the show. And one of the perks you get as a patron, well, one, you get to actually watch us live and see the video. But if you can't make it live, because our audience is global, honey, you get to ask your question ahead of time. So we're going to start with those questions.
Yeah.
So Dolly was asking ahead of time. She said, I don't think that Noor was murdered because of honor. She was murdered by her boyfriend Zahir when he tried to break up with him, and when she tried to break up with him, and then he murdered her. So we kind of talked about this earlier. So I would agree with you in the sense that like there isn't any sort of Islamic doctrine that validates this, right? But I would say that it's honor, and he wasn't a male family member, which is what you see in a lot of honor-based violence. Is it from that woman's actual family members? I learned when I was researching this that it's often her own siblings, because the young men will get a lesser sentence because they're juveniles, which just is so messed up. But to get back to the point was, her murder was not her relation, had no blood relation to her, but I would still consider it honor-based violence because it has to do with a feeling of possession over woman, a right to possess her. And also sometimes, we see this in the West where it's almost a man's sense of shame that he couldn't have her. It's like almost to save his own face. Like to spare himself the shame of being rejected, I think is kind of another flavor of this kind of violence. Do you have any thoughts on this, Ali?
No, I completely agree with you. I think that this is Dolly. What you're saying here, the boyfriend Zahir, when she tried to break up, he killed her. I mean, that is what happens in a lot of these honor killings. And honor culture is based on this idea that you have to possess women, but that you're entitled to certain behaviors from women, and if you don't get them, then it's your right to do whatever you want. So that sense of entitlement and possession by men is really at the heart of what honor culture is.
It reminds me of a few months ago, I had it up before my computer crashed, but there was a woman who was a law student in London, and I think she was actually a native of Belgium, but she was visiting back home in Pakistan, and there were two men who were fighting over her hand in marriage, basically.
Yeah.
And she rejected both of them, and while she was still in Pakistan, they murdered her for it. So it comes, again, down to this attitude of, that was the word I was looking for, entitlement.
Yes.
And she follows up with saying, my question is, Zahir claimed he is a U.S. national and has schizophrenia. Do you think that will get him released? This is a legal question that is way above my purview. So I can't answer this well. I would hope not. But if there is a conflict of nationality, that is going to complicate things.
Yeah, the U.S. national, I think the U.S., that's true. I think he is a U.S. citizen from what I read, and I could be wrong. But I think that there was a statement from the U.S. embassy that said that they're not going to interfere. If he's committed a crime in this country, he's subject to the rules of wherever he is and the crime that he committed. So yeah, I don't think that's going to get him off the schizophrenia thing, they're going to bring in experts to talk about it. There is a lot of pressure on them to prosecute this guy. I think there's a lot of pressure even from sort of elite members of society in the same stratum of society that he belongs to. We're very outraged about this. And a lot of them have a lot of influence too. So I think he's going to have a really hard time getting away with it. But it is true that a lot of people generally in this situation who have not received the kind of media attention, the pressure that he did, often do get away with it. They're able to leave the country, go somewhere else. They're able to pay blood money. There's a lot of, sometimes what they do is a lot of these rich guys, like they'll go and they'll abuse a woman who is, you know, not as rich, underprivileged, and
or a religious minority in particular.
Right.
And rampant in Pakistan.
And when that comes up, there's a concept of blood money, and what they'll do is, like, you know, if they end up killing this woman or whatever, they just pay them a whole bunch of money, which is a lot for the family, but it's not a whole lot for them, like the person who's paying it. And they are allowed to, then that's it. They're off scot-free. And that happens a lot.
It's horrible. That reminds me, I was watching, I've been kind of doing a deep dive into like Shia Islam, and I was watching Dr. Ammar Naqshwani, and he's like kind of the Shirazi Shia bent. And he was talking about this very controversial subject of how do you handle these situations. And he was talking about how his school of thought says that if your father or husband beats you, he's actually owes you money, like literal blood money. And it has very specific breakdowns of how much money they owe you based on the nature of the injury. And they either can like pay you this back immediately, or it's going to be owed to you upon their death, like, which was a very new concept to me. And that's obviously more into the scholarly vein of their particular denomination and less of the immediate source text, primary sources, you know. But that was very new concept to me, of like a very specific breakdown of like they give you a black eye like they owe you like a diamond kind of situation.
Yeah.
So D is asking a question: what role would you give right-wing, quote unquote, traditional family advocates in honor culture? So D, I'm not sure if you're talking about in like an American Western context or like a general right-wing context, but this reminds me of something that I actually wanted to touch on in this episode, is what is happening in Turkey. So Turkey, because of President Erdogan's government, pulled out of something called the Istanbul Convention, which is basically an international covenant that is meant to not only improve, it's an international covenant that is meant to like kind of incentivize or countries to strengthen their own domestic laws that help protect women and some gender and sexual minorities. And Turkey was the first country to sign on to this convention around like 2009 or 2011. And they actually, within the past few months, they've pulled out of the convention because Erdogan's party says that this effort to protect women is against family values. And they said that it is emancipating women in a way that is against their cultural standards, and that it's a Western concept, and that, you know, we have our own way of doing things, blah, 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 which is, there's been a huge movement protesting this in Turkey, especially considering that there has been an epidemic of femicides in the country, really severe violence against women that started the so-called Challenge Accepted movement, or kind of social media campaign. And I don't know, it just really makes me think of like how horrible, I mean, I just really want to go in. I just really like how horrible is your culture and your cultural standards that like a covenant to strengthen laws that protect vulnerable members of your society are seen as antithetical to your own culture and your own values. It just really disgusts me. Like, what do you think about this, Ali? What role would you give right-wing traditional family advocates in honor culture?
I think that there is a connection. So I like, what's really interesting is like, when we talk about honor culture, and have you heard the term culture of honor? A culture of honor is what the traditional culture of the South in the U.S. is referred to. So they have purity balls, and you have like, you give your virginity to your dad, and he holds it, and he's like until you give it to your husband.
The purity balls thing is actually a very recent invention, but I understand what you're getting at.
Yeah, no, it's an old concept, new manifestation. I mean, now it's just purity balls. Before that, it was a lot worse. So there is these traditional, right wing advocates of family, like this idea that women have to take a second class position, that they are they're supposed to be subservient to their husbands. The whole concept of chivalry is rooted in sexism. There are things about it that obviously they're nice. You don't, if you want to move Susanna, there's a lot of guys will help you carry all your stuff if they want to, and I don't think you'll complain too much. You're like, all right, I'll milk it while I have it. So those aspects.
It's kind of nice. But then you're like, oh no.
yeah. So there's and some of all of us have that. Like, I'm gonna pay on the first date, and it's weird not to. So things like that, like those elements of chivalry are still there, but overall chivalrous cultures tend to be more rooted in sexism, because they are, it's the job of the men to protect the women from other men, from the gaze of society, and from them becoming, say, too liberated and going out and having their own sexual freedom or whatever it is. And it's the same thing. It's the same concept of entitlement. It's the same concept of possession, having some possession. And if someone acts differently than you want them to, if your daughter goes rogue or something, then that is an insult to your honor. You have failed as a parent. You'll be shamed in front of in your community and in your church. So a lot of these concepts are still prevalent, even in Western society, especially in the U.S., because the U.S. tends to be a lot more religious than most other Western countries, secular countries. So the right-wing traditional family thing, Rick Santorum having like 7 kids because he doesn't believe in having sex with his wife unless he's going to reproduce. That whole thing is just, it's right there, and he was a presidential candidate.
Yeah, well, I mean, it comes from this whole concept that seems particularly emphasized in Christianity. Actually, that's my own bias. Never mind. But it's that sex is not for you; it is for expanding God's people. So it's not for your own enjoyment; it's for making God's people as numerous as the stars. And it's for that explicit purpose,
which biology completely counters. Because then why would God invent the clitoris, right? The clitoris has no reproductive function, no excretion function. It's the only organ in the entire human body, male or female, that has absolutely no function whatsoever except for sexual pleasure. Like the penis has a reproductive function and urinary function. The vagina also has a reproductive function, but the clitoris, you don't pee out of it. You don't give.
I was wondering if we were going to be able to make it through an episode without Ali talking about genitalia, and the answer is no.
We're talking about honor-based violence. This is what it is. This is, God created this party button, right?
It's the devil's button.
So the Christians are completely wrong.
Dolly is also asking about your book, saying, is it free? Is the book free, Ali? And
Dolly,
is it on Amazon?
Of course not.
Kindle?
Of course not. That wouldn't be fair at all. But why don't you just email me? It's aliamjadrizvi@gmail.com. It's on my Twitter bio. Just email me and we'll see if we can find a place where.
Yeah. I heard that there are also some Arabic translations of your book floating around the web. Is this true?
I don't know about Arabic translation. Yeah, but I don't know about Arabic ones. I know there's a Persian one, and I know there's an Indonesian one. I have that.
Oh, cool! Wow.
And then there's an actual official Dutch version as well. So yeah, there are a few here and there.
Dee is asking a question. She's saying there are no scripture in Islam or Hinduism, as far as I know, that directs killing of women in honor of men. So what is the link to religion? I think we've covered this.
Yeah.
to a large extent. I'm not, to be honest, extremely familiar with the actual text regarding like Hinduism. And it's also way harder to get at with Hinduism because it's a way more heterogeneous practice that oftentimes isn't very directly tied to text. I get the sense, or what people tell me, especially who grew up in these backgrounds, that it's more just kind of based on like legends and stories and different values and specific ritualized practice, and less like it says to do this here.
Yeah.
But I mean, there are a lot of legends that involve a lot of violence against women, usually regarding the preservation of chastity or proving one's chastity. Just look up what Lord Rama did to Sita. It's not good.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of honor based violence in these stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So subservience to the husband, for instance, is a very fundamental concept in the Hindu religion. Again, you said it's heterogeneous, so many people will dispute it. You've got this text, the Manusmriti, which is just like old legal text that's very central to Hinduism. But if you talk to a lot of these New Age sort of Hindu type people who are apologists, they will say, "No, that has nothing to do with Hinduism. It is not. Hinduism is about something completely different." And they will say that Hinduism is just as rational as atheism, which is an idiotic proposition, obviously. But there's there are practices like sati. Like sati is a practice where when your husband dies, then the woman, his wife, no matter how young she is, she has
goes on the funeral pyre with him.
And she's burned. Yeah, she's also killed along with him. So this is something that obviously very, very few people do that today. But
it's outlawed.
Yeah. I don't think anybody does that today. I just always say very few because I'm sure there's somebody somewhere.
Yeah.
Still doing it as always. But so I think that it's not necessarily. I don't think that there's no place, and we actually made it very clear in the beginning of this that honor killings, the direct act of honor killings, is not something that is sanctioned by Islamic scripture or really any religion that I know of, right? That says you should kill women for honor. But there is a system, right? There's a system that's in place that's rooted in religion that allows for the perpetuation of the mindset that this is a direct manifestation of, right?
We can explicitly say that religion does, if you're looking at religious law, specifically Islam, there is a specific lessened sentence or punishment towards men who kill their own daughters. So it's very clear when you study a lot of specific cases that I'm thinking specifically in Iran last summer, there was a month where there was like a spate of honor killings, which is more rare in Iranian society. It's very just speaking to Armin, he talks about, how like frowned upon and just shocking that is, because it's really not something that's socially condoned. And it's very clear when you look into some of the cases of what happened around these women that there were specific calculations that these male family members made towards the sentence that they're going to face being worth it to commit this act of violence, which ties into what I was saying with Turkey. When I was watching today to prepare a little mini episode talking about this Istanbul Convention and the impact it's going to have on women in Turkey, and they profiled this one woman who was facing a severe threat from her husband, who she was trying to divorce. And he, just horrific threats towards her. And when Erdogan started signaling that he was going to back out of this convention, this husband even specifically said to her, referencing this convention, or the removal of it, I'm only going to have to do 3 years for killing you, so I'll do it. It is a conscious decision that many perpetrators make, a cost-benefit analysis. where they're like, actually what I face isn't that much of a disincentive. Like, it's so scary, and it just really emphasizes how much there need to be firm standards that can't be easily repealed to protect the most vulnerable in society. And women are, just because of our physical constitution, we're just a softer target.
Yeah, there's a lot of like these things are related. Like an example of it is, we talked about the Virgin Mary and how, virginity is thought of as a virtue, and it's thought of as purity and innocence and chastity. And, so when you have that, is female genital mutilation, is that something that is, it's that's not allowed in Christianity. It's allowed in some sects of Islam. It's, it's not it's only obligatory in I think the Shafi'i school of thought, and the Bora Ismaili Muslims, and a few other sort of communities where it is. But I mean, that is a direct, it's a manifestation of that whole idea, the whole idea that, women are virginity supposed to be virtuous, like the sexual side of women should be completely, it should not be prominent at all. It's only the reproductive part of it that should be highlighted. Other things like slut shaming, for example, are also directly related to that glorification of virginity. So these are,
and even the hijab itself.
The hijab itself, covering up your women so that other men can't, like, this idea of possession and honor, they're all rooted in that. So even if these honor killings, or a lot of the ways that these concepts and these ideologies and mindsets the way that they manifest themselves downstream, it makes them harder to fight, and it makes them harder to eradicate from a society because of fundamentals that are driving them at their root, right, are still in place, and you can't challenge them because it's blasphemy.
Yep. Well, dang, I think we did a really good job covering all the bases.
I hope so. Well, let's see. Yeah, I think that there's so much. There's obviously a lot to talk about when it comes to this topic, right? There are many other things, and there's many other facets to it. But maybe another time. This is not a topic that I think is going to be exhausted anytime soon. This is actually one of my major drivers to one of the reasons I became an atheist. I thought that the Quran was just very inconsistent and was obviously a man-made book. So yeah, we can touch on other aspects of it in other episodes.
Yeah, no, I want to keep talking to you forever, but we have to cut it off somewhere.
Right.
Are there any other plugs we need to make towards the end of the episode? Besides, guys, if you're listening, please like this video. Please subscribe to the channel. Share it with your friends who maybe have questions about how much this can be directly attributed to religion. And if you're able, consider supporting the show on Patreon, and you can get all the episodes live or get your question addressed for as little as $1 a month. So
yeah, exactly. So that's, if you're listening to this on YouTube, like and subscribe. If you're listening to this on iTunes, then please give us a rating, right? That's going to help us rank higher. So wherever you're listening to this about, and otherwise share the episode if you liked it. Yeah.
Yes.
We're good. Next time.
Yay. Cool.
Excellent.
Thank you for joining us, everyone, and see you next week.
See you next. Be best.